Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Özge Ersoy. I'm part of the curatorial team at AAA. And we're very, very excited to welcome Hammad Nasar for tonight's talk at our library. Hammad Nasar is a curator, writer, and strategic advisor based in London. For us, he also has a very special heart, special place in our hearts. He's a very long-time friend of AAA and also a former colleague, having served as the head of research and programs from 2012 to 2016. So today, Hammad will speak about Making New Worlds, Li Yuan-chia and Friends, the exhibition he recently co-curated at Kettle's Yard, University of Cambridge. This exhibition highlights the work of the late artist, poet, and polymath Li Yuan-chia and the LYC Museum Art Gallery that he led from 1962 to 1983. Making New Worlds is a powerful example of the type of projects that Hammad is interested in, focusing on propositional, collaborative, and exhibition-led research projects. And other recent exhibitions include Beyond the Page, South Asian Miniature Painting and Britain, 1600 to now, and we actually have the exhibition catalog thanks to Hammad. British Art Show 9 in 2021, Turner Prize in 2021, and Rock, Paper, Scissors Position in Play in the United Arab Emirates Pavilion at the 57th Venice Biennale in 2017. Hammad was also the co-founder of Green Cardamom in London, executive director of Stuart Hall Foundation, and he has held senior research fellowships at the University of the Arts London's Decolonizing Arts Institute and Yale University's Paul Mellon Center. What I would like to add is that Making New Worlds really resonates deeply with the interest that we have as the Asia Art Archive team in the ways that we explore how archives socialize, how we think about the role of artist organizers in shaping and challenging art historical narratives, and also how artists intervene into archives and how they think about the archive as an effective medium. So welcome back, Hammad. It's amazing to have you back in Hong Kong, and thanks so much for sharing your research with us.
Thank you, Özge, Chris, well, everybody here for on a Friday evening at 7. Hats off to you guys for an art historical lecture. I'm going to share just a walk through this project with you in the next maybe 45 minutes or so, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions. It feels really special to be here, to be talking to you about this project, because this project started here with a fragment of an archive. And as a start, and this will be the only bit that I read out, as I'm sort of notorious for sharing notes and then not sticking to them. But there are two things that I wanted to share with you. And they both come from a text I've recently contributed to a new book that Jainton Davidson and Amelia Jones have edited. And my text was the chapter on the archive. And I want to sort of just read 2 points. The first, and you can sort of read here, but I'll read it out as well. So most archives are not available for research or are accessible only at great cost. In contrast, and in line with the supply-driven nature of most art historical research, those more easily available are overused. What results from this structural imbalance is a discipline where ghosts lurking within archives often stay trapped there, or emerge slowly in single file, blinking into the occasional light of attention, the monographic show, the special booth in an art fair, only to return to archival catacombs again until summoned. So just that, I think this also points to the work of AAA in terms of digitizing and addressing the economics of accessing archives. So how do we, tap the energies that exist and bring attention, socialize that community that Özge was talking about? And Making New Worlds, this exhibition, was very much set up to try and be a case study for that. How do we think about the exhibition as a kind of infrastructure? So Making New Worlds makes the case for the archivally informed exhibition as a platform capacious enough to allow entangled histories to be acknowledged and explored. It is an argument to treat the exhibition as shape-shifting infrastructure, fed by and feeding the archive, but remaining a site of encounter, discovery, and possibility. I've often used the metaphor, and you'll forgive me, I use a lot of metaphors. I often use the metaphor of the base camp, where the idea of what we're doing is not about trying to get to the summit, but finding a base camp, building one, or pushing an existing one higher. And that's very much with the spirit. These are the 2 points I wanted to make about accessing archives and using the exhibition as infrastructure to do so. And here are some Asiad Archive digitized images. So this was also part of one of the what are called pocket archival projects that we did while I was in Hong Kong. And it is an exhibition curated by Rashid Araeen, artist, curator, polemicist, activist. You can add as many descriptors as you choose. And this was a really important exhibition held at the Hammad Gallery. It was a polemical intervention in the story of post-war art in Britain. And in some ways was exemplified this idea of complex geography. So when we set about the work of thinking about how Asiad Archive channels what it does, this was one of that ideas. As art history likes its nations, its regions, its linguistic groups, but how do we mix that up? And by amalgamating people of Asian and Afro-Caribbean heritage in Britain, this exhibition did a lot of that in spades. So in a 2015 conference session of British art history through exhibitions, 1900 to now, which was organized by the Yale Center for British Art and the Paul Mellon Center, I argued that Rashid Araeen's The Other Story is haunting British art history. So this, again, is from the AAA archives. You see Rashid's work at the back, and in front you see the cosmic point magnetic discs of Li Yuan-chia. So Li and Rashid we'll come back to. So, and in this paper I argued that not only is this exhibition haunting British art history, but I read the more recent Tate Britain's exhibition called Migrations, Journeys into British Art, as an example of such a haunting, where many of the artworks, certainly all the artists that were shown at the Hayward, were now being shown at Tate Britain. So it took about 23 years for these artworks to move from the South Bank to Millbank, just across the river, but they did not cause a ripple in the narratives and the sort of the flows of art history in which they were embedded. And as artists like Rashid in places like Sharjah and Karachi are having new shows, producing new catalogs, or Li Yuan-chia being sort of claimed as the father of conceptual and abstract art in Taiwan, a place he left in 1962 and never went back. So as these sort of claims are taking place from places that have perhaps more money, more visibility in the circuits of global art world, I argued that British art history, there's this potential of it being overwritten before these more complex stories of British art history have yet to be written. So there was this empire-shaped hole in the histories, and I was interested in how we work through arts histories to tackle it. Out of that paper, so I've often described the work that we do, so half the work is bringing things into the archive, the other half is inviting other people in. Another metaphor was that of, the firecracker in the street. So in this case, it's the paper, which is the firecracker in the street. You burst a firecracker, people come to their windows to have a look, to see what's going on. So a couple of people came to their windows. First was the Paul Mellon Center. And out of that came the London Asia project that I co-led with Sarah Turner, who is now the director of the Paul Mellon Center. It was supposed to be 2 years. Now, 7 years later, we finally, the Making New Worlds project has been the mic drop moment of that project. And what we were doing, so the comma that you see after London is possessive. So it's about thinking about London as a site within Asia's art history, and then flipping that around to say, well, what happens if we start accounting for people like David Madia or Li Yuan-chia or Rashid Araeen as British artists? What does that do to our understanding of conceptual art in Britain, or to the genealogies of abstraction, or the histories of sculpture? And a bit like sort of keyhole surgery, we used 3 lenses through which to look at this. So the exhibition, called minor institutions, so institutions like the Commonwealth Institute, the British Council, not the Tate or the V&A, and art schools through which to look at this. One of the other people who was listening to this talk was the artist Sonia Boyce. And she was just about to start her project called Black Artists and Modernism, which was in a way picking up the baton from where Rashid left it with the other story, and thinking about how the work of artists of Asian and African heritage have been accounted for or been missed out of the accounts of modernism in British art. So she invited me to curate an exhibition as part of and in response to the Black Artists and Modernism project. And this is the exhibition Speech Acts, Reflection, Imagination, and Repetition. So a speech act is where the utterance itself is the act. And for me, this exhibition was both an invitation and a question mark. And the question was around, how do we receive stories, and what work do museums do? Who gets to write narratives, and do they change? And we drew from the works of 4 major collections in Manchester and Bradford, including the University of Manchester's special collections at the John Rylands Library, who hold Li Yuan-chia's archive. And we sort of set this up under sort of three overarching themes, but the overall structure was around, why do some works become highlights and others are framed through geography or biography? And what happens if we juxtapose them, and what stories could emerge from those encounters? You will recognize the 2 artists, or you may, I'll point them out to you. So it's Li Yuan-chia and Rashid Araeen again. So working with that juxtaposition of the other story, but with a different work. Now, the show was 40 plus artists, more than 80 works. We're not going to go through all of them. But what I wanted to do was just give you a little flavor of the sorts of questions we were raising. And again, that idea of the base camp is how we were trying to push things higher and see where it goes from here. So this hand-colored tinted print of Li's is a beautiful work. But what it also shows you is an artist. This is a self-portrait where the self is not visible, which he shares with Rashid Araeen's Christmas Day. Sorry, I'm not sure how clear it is, but this is 4 attempts of Rashid trying to photograph himself in the reflections of a moving London tube on Christmas Day in 1979. Now, you think about it, he's got an analog camera, which is in front of his face. It's a moving train, very little light. He's not going to take a photograph of himself. So again, the idea of how do you present yourself? What is the self? And you contrast that with the confident self of David Hockney, engaging not only with New York, but with art history in Hogarth's A Rake's Progress. Just sort of flipping through some of the other artists who were in this section about how artists place themselves in conversation with those around them and with history. So James Northcote's Othello, The Moor of Venice, Shutapa Biswas, Lubna Himid, across from Gilbert and George, dating from 1986. So that was the first section around self and placement within history. The second was about how the me becomes we, you know? And at its heart was the stylized reconstruction of the LYC Museum and Art Gallery that you see here. And I'm not going to make the heroic assumption that everybody knows who Li is, so I'm going to give you a 30-second introduction. So Li was born in mainland China in 1929. He moves to Taiwan in 1949 as a sort of a war orphan. He's part of really important art groups like Tonfan. But 1962, he moves to Bologna, where he is part of Il Punto. And then at the invitation of David Badaya, he moves to London and shows twice at the Signals Gallery, that influential space, and then has 3 solo shows at the recently formed Listen Gallery. Then in 1967, he moves up to Cumbria for Christmas, you know, to spend a week with friends, stays for the rest of his life. Buys this old farm building from Winifred Nicholson, the painter, and then converts that into the LYC Museum and Art Gallery. So you see that original window was made by David Nash, you see, in the 10 years that he ran the LYC, he showed the work of over 320 artists, ranging from giving Andy Goldsworthy his first ever show. So the hazel stick throw was made for his show at the LYC. But he creates the children's art room, where Li himself spends all Saturday, every Saturday, in the children's art room. You can just about, it's open 9 to 7, 365 days a year. At its peak, he's doing 4 shows a month, for which he designs the catalog. Everybody gets the same catalog, same format. You know, he does everything apart from make the tea and butter the scones. You know? But also there's there are rug making classes, there are events for children. That space can be rented out for community projects, for theatrical groups. And he becomes this sort of, polymath whose expansive view of art sort of covers all. And one sort of beautiful example of the artist Sheila Wakely, who went and showed at Li, who saw it for what it was, very much, and she says it was a work of his, imbued with his aesthetic, and walks us through how he did all these things himself, and that, the museum, drawing, painting, encouraging children, that expansion of the view of what art can be. So I left with my belief in art revitalized. So that's what he says. She says. So in our show at Manchester, we showed some of the artists. So that's Sheila Wakely's work on my extreme right, Barbara Hepworth, Winifred Nicholson, some archival material that relates to some of those artists. But this group of artists has not really accounted for within ideas of a group, or even of knowing each other. I mean, art history as a discipline, I would say museums as a structure, are very neat-minded places. They don't like wrinkles. They come with an iron and steam it all out. And part of what we were trying to do in this exhibition was, how do you stage that complexity? Allow those multiplicities and conversations to exist. So where this group is not so well known, this particular group, the so-called School of London, every single art museum of any size up and down the British Isles have a smattering of the Group of London, which in great irony has an American, Kittai, 2 German-born artists, sort of Auerbach and Freud, an Irish artist, Francis Bacon, and then you do have David Hockney as the sort of the Brit, even if he is sort of queer and a northerner from Bradford and now settled in California. But that's fine as a School of London. So just thinking back again about the liberal immigration policies in the middle of the 20th century that allowed such a group to exist. And then we can sort of think about it in relation to others. And then the last section was this idea of repetition, raising the rhetorical question of, do forms migrate? Well, of course they do. And what we were sort of doing here, and you'll recognize perhaps the work of Kim Lim right in front, Anwar Jalal Shamsa on either side, of Fehren Nisa Zaid, and Bridget Riley. And the Urdu language has no separate word for art and craft. So they are both fun. And the painting on the right has a little inscription in Urdu which says, a circle, a square, a puzzle. One lifetime is not enough to solve. And in a way, it acts like a manifesto, and then Shamsa spent the rest of his life trying to address that. So you see another work of Shamsa and the sort of the top right corner, a painting called Meeting, shown alongside his contemporary, the textile designer Barbara Brown, who designed textiles for heels. But works that are usually being separated by, textile collection, painting put together, or Paolozzi and his industrial design work as well as his sculpture. You will see Rashid Araeen's Christmas Day again, because we wanted to actually make visible that curatorial conceit of framing. So Rashid gave us the permission to produce an exhibition copy. So we had the same work showing in two different sections, thinking about how you wish to frame it, as an idea of a self-portrait or as a conceptual strategy of repetition. Similarly, we did the same thing with, what stays within the archive. So these three variations were at John Rylands, what becomes a stamped artwork. The top framed one within, appropriately black from the foundation. And thinking about that journey between the archival document and the work of art, and how it can be, I think, flexible and changeable, and how that takes place. Given the spirit of the LYC, we of course had to create a children's art room, complete with what Lee had is the hexagonal ping pong table. So if you think about it, if there are 3 people playing ping pong, how do you score? What is that game? Actually, it becomes something else. It becomes something else from a competition with points to something to do together with friends. And one of the other things we did was, rather than borrow the museum object, which were the magnetic discs, we took permission from the foundation to recreate our own. Because for Lee, moving them around and for people to be able to move them around was part of the work. And that was what we wanted to recreate. And you see a film. The only commission for the exhibition was a new work by the artist Helen Petz. And this goes back to, I think, a conversation Ozge and I were having just earlier, where she was talking about how the library and sort of creating the space for artists to come in. And this was very much inviting Helen to come in, was very much in that spirit. Because I had very little time, less than 8 months, to make this exhibition, and even less budget. And in my experience, the most voracious consumers and devourers of archives are artists. So invited Helen to go to town on the John Rylands Li Yuan-chia archive, and she produced this magnificent film, which mixed her own footage with Lee's footage. She discovered, up till now, undiscovered sound. So we heard Lee's own voice sharing his aspirations, his plans for the LYC Museum. And then we also did a symposium, and as around that idea of the base kank or invitation, we invited new commissions, Madeleine Huikas, who produced a new film in the footsteps of Li Yuan-chia and Delia Derbyshire. Delia Derbyshire, for those of you who don't know, was for a time, Li's partner and assistant. And she is sort of known more widely as, she's the woman who arranged the Doctor Who theme tune. So she was that pioneering figure of the BBC Radiophonics workshop. But what does it mean that she spent a year of her life helping Li run the LYC Museum and Art Gallery up in Cumbria? Anyway, so that was one of the commissions we made. But with base camps and invitations, you actually have people come in and who engage. And this was our experience. A young curator by the name of Annie Jael Kwon came to see the opening of the exhibition, had never come across Li's work before, was really kind of blown away by it. At the end, came and approached me to say, well, she was setting up this group called Asia Art Activism, another AAA, which was trying to build together a community of artists from East and Southeast Asia working in the UK and having a tough old time of it. And I think they all saw Li as a kind of cultural ancestor. So with our support, they applied for and got an Arts Council grant to do a series of new performances. Here's Bettina Fung, Towards All or Nothing, where a durational performance where she makes these 26 circles, one for each year that Li was in Cumbria, and then erases them, and then collects those shavings and becomes a cosmic point that stays. And then this really stunning performance by Nicholas T, a Singapore-based artist, who actually now written about in that text that I shared with you earlier for Amelia Jones and Jane Davidson's book, where, 2 weeks before this performance, this was about Li Yuan-chia, and 2 weeks before the performance, Li Wen died. So thinking about Li Wen and also that his famous Yellow Man performance that also took place in London, so very London, Asia, Nick chose to respond to both. And I'll sort of share a few more installation images, but part of what he wanted to do was also think through how some of those stories just repeat. And what he wanted to do was end his performance, and he'd been trained to do this safely, that he was going to carve the word bloody foreigner in his torso. Manchester Art Gallery is a council-run estate in a city which has had a concern about self-harm amongst young people. The permission was not granted. So, then followed a dance of how much do we want to know from what they were going to do. The official thing was that the performance would end by Nick walking out of the gallery. So I'll show you some images, and for those who are squeamish, you will see some blood there. But what Nick did was he did, as agreed with Annie, walk out and then write bloody foreigner on his torso. But he withheld the final part even from Annie. And then instead of that being the end of the performance, he went back into Manchester Art Gallery with a very worried Annie, and you can see that in the shaky last two images, as Nick then went to the opening of the exhibition and rubbed his torso just where Li's red tinted photograph was. So this melancholy but also defiant work, where the red of a different generation speaks to the red of an earlier one. Another artist who attended the symposium was the artist Aaron Tan, who was doing a PhD on Li Yuan-chia. And then later on, I had the opportunity as part of the curatorial group for A Century of the Artist Studio at the Whitechapel to commission him to produce a new work. And he produced this replica of Li's kitchen cabinet. And Li had this, he'd done a spherical studio. So if you can imagine how you would actually build that, it was a utopic dream. And instead of using that model, Aaron built something himself, filmed it, and then projected it onto this frying pan. Li was famous for being, how shall we do this, very spare with his what he did. Nothing was wasted. So he would cook eat and serve on that same frying pan. So that felt an appropriate vessel. And then this work was shown straddled by Kurt Schwitter's Merzbau, so a similar story, also in the same area, and Martha Rosler's Semiotics of the Kitchen. So thinking about those things in play. Yet more artists, so Haegu Yang, the Berlin-based artist originally from Korea. I don't know if she saw the exhibition or saw the documentary about the exhibition on the BBC, but was so moved by it that she decided that as an entry to her own exhibition at Tate St. Ives, you would enter the exhibition through a little pocket exhibition of Li, Barbara Hepworth, and Naum Gabo. And then she invited me to write on her and Li. I had not at that time met Haegu Yang, but I loved this idea of a conversation, an invitation, having never met me. So I decided to repay that in kind and wrote about it without talking to her, to say, what would these works say to each other if they met? And why is this, contemporary artist in Berlin talking to this, deceased artist in Cumbria? More than that, Haegu not only showed his work, but created a new body of work, which I just found out from Russell is now sitting in Australia. So this is the broom and you can see the broom that Lee's holding. So she created these 3 sonic intermediaries, one on Li, one on Gabo, and one on Hepworth. So the way we built up the exhibition at Kettle's Yard was we involved many of these people we've been talking about. People who knew Li, so people like Madeleine Huikas, people who were studying him, like Aaron Tan, people who were interested in engaging with him, like Haegu Yang, or Annie, or Nick T, and Bettina Fung. But also at the same time, I was at that time curating the British Art Show. And as part of that exhausting privilege, I went up and down the country with my co-curator, Irene Aristasabal. We sort of did something like 230 to 250 studio visits in 23 cities. And one of the things we saw, the idea was not to have a theme which we find artists into, but try and understand what artists are responding to and sort of abstract that into ideas. And one of those ideas really felt very Lee-like, around tactics for togetherness, around imagining new futures, new ways of working, new ways of thinking about art. And one of the artists that invited in, who had never heard of Lee, was the artist Grace Diritu, who within 3 months of reading the text I sent her, attending one of the workshops, had also decided to adopt Lee as a cultural ancestor, and then showed his work inside her own survey show at SMAC in Belgium, and then produced a new body of work for our show. So I'm going to end now with just showing a few installation images of the work in Kettle's Yard. Why Kettle's Yard? So for those of you who don't know it, Kettle's Yard is probably one of the most storied, art house museums in the UK. It was put together by Jim Eade, who was a curator at Tate and was famously known as a friend of the artists. He talked about Winifred Nicholson, the artist who sold her barn to Lee, as his artistic godmother. So she took him under his wing, introduced him to all these artists. And so from that storied art museum felt like a really appropriate place to hold the story of the art museum that was forgotten, which is now a ruin, the LYC, which applied twice to get a heritage grant and was rejected. Similar to Kurt Schwitter's, by the way, and the Merzbau. So that then felt an appropriate conversation to have. This is one of the galleries, one of the main galleries, and this framing is this idea of the cosmic point, the beginning and the end of everything. And we wanted to be able to show people this journey that Li went on, where that point was coming out of ink painting, the ink point, and you see this in his early works, to the people he was in conversation with, Xiao Qin, also part of Tonfan, who was the artist who invited Li to come to Bologna, Winifred Nicholson, in the middle work, and her work with sort of prismatic and paintings and Christian science beliefs, and her daughter Kate Nicholson, the artist, who you see the call to prayer. So a different kind of technology for reaching the cosmos, a different kind of technology to the signals of Takis, to the cosmic flares of Lillian Lin. So if you remember, this is work taking place in the late 60s, early 70s, the time of the moon landing. You see Andy Goldsworthy again, yet another seminal work that he made for his LYC show, where he's digging the black hole. So how to make a black hole. So that is dug on the side of the hill that the LYC was on. And up top you see both the manifesto of David Madaya, and this wonderful video work of Charvet Sai, where she draws this circle on ice in ink, and then it sort of dissipates. So the thinking about the cosmic as the beginning and the end. And then the second major gallery was playing with that idea of space, time, life, how the LYC and Li put these different tribes of art together, So things like that high conceptual art of land art that we was just talking about, people like Andy Goldsworthy. But here you see Li's textile works, which are really functional. So these are wind excluders, So the Cumbria Lake District is a cold, wet, windy place. So these things were hung at the back of doors. Winifred Nicholson apparently bought 7 of them, gifted them to many bits of her family. Some of them are now in public museums. What you see here is the work of Sheila Wakely in unfired clay, whose quote we heard earlier. So this is called Towards the Inside of a Container. So how can you have sculpture that approaches a feeling? She's trying to share that with you through this installation. Towards the back, you can see Thatis Blacker and Batik. For the sharp-sighted of you, you can maybe just make out right at the sort of the right to me corner a piece of slate that's taken from David Nash's The Mountain in front of his studio, and a collaborative work that he made with the Romanian-born artist Paul Neagu. Leisure Clark, Mira Chandel. I mean, each one of these is like a little chapter on its own. Mira Chandel, so Li and Mira Chandel showed together at Signals and at Listen. And believe it or not, Li was Mira Chandel's translator because they shared the Italian language. So Mira went around London with Li and made works to Li and that correspondence. And then we went back to David Nash to see whether he would restore the window. And he made one of these beautiful interventions where he said, no, I'm not going to restore the window, but we'll just preserve it. So you see that old window, but just within acrylic and with sort of steel support. And that then goes back to that idea of porosity, which I see so much in Li's own work, but also the way he made the LYC, where you can see through things. We also commissioned a drawing machine like the one that was there in the children's art room at LYC. This was made by Anna Brownstead with local school children who decided to christen the machine Jamal. You can see that it's been repurposed out of material that was lying around, so easels and pencils and bricks and stone. We repurposed Aaron's installation that was shown at the Whitechapel. Grace did a whole new series of protest carpets. These were then rolled out, and children's activities would take place on the carpets. So you see the one down below. We also did a satellite exhibition at Jesus College, Cambridge, centering on Li's ink work, along which Charvet, for the first time, worked with ceramics, and worked with ceramics as a practice, where she would make a pot every day in the morning. And then this was then left open for people to put things in or take things out during the course of the exhibition. We tried to mirror some of the bits that Li was doing, and also in conversation with Jimmy and Kettle's Yard. And then we ended this with 2 new commissions and a day of poetry. Nicholas T. made another unbelievable work called Communing with Li, and Noëlette de Leon did a performance piece communing with David Madia. Last, but not least, we use this base camp idea again. So if we go back to that quote I started with around how difficult accessing archives are. So Li's archives were deposited at Manchester University's John Rylands Library more than 20 years ago. This is a Russell Group university, one of the sort of the best known. John Rylands is a research institute. This archival collection is still not cataloged. So thinking about accessing this, you need to, 1, get permission, 2, you need to go to Manchester, you need to pay for accommodation, and then you need to request every single item by item, and then it'll be brought out to you. So what we ended up doing with this was, again, as a kind of sort of or nudging things along, is we got all the catalogs that they have in their collection digitized. And they are now available for research. They're not yet public, but if you're researching and you apply to them, they'll give you access. And then the hope is over time, we'll work through the permissions to make this public. So this then becomes that base camp that we lift higher and reminds us about, the work never finishes with the archive. I think I'm going to stop that there, and maybe we'll take some questions. Thank you. Sorry, one last thing is this book is now at Asian Archive Library. I'm very, very proud of it. I think all of us are. This also, the conference that we ran in Manchester, all the people who, well, not all the people, many of the people who came to that have contributed to this book. And it felt really important for us for the book to be polyvocal. Because in the spirit of Li, it needed to have multiple voices, people writing about his poetry, people writing about his publishing practice, people placing him in the context of cultural ancestry, but then also in this idea of friendship as method.
Thank you, Hammad. I think it's a great moment to open up for questions and comments.
Thanks for the talk. That was really fascinating. And I'm really fascinated by this idea of friendship as a method. And I wonder how can visitors engage with these ideas when they enter the exhibition, because apparently there's a lot of works and there's a lot of connections between artists. How do you communicate these ideas or these histories and context to visitors in the exhibitions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, the short answer is that we're trying to resist the urge to kind of chew people's food for them, but give enough information or enough ideas. So one of the things, as you would have seen, is this is a very large exhibition in not a very large space. But the works kind of talk to each other. And we wanted to respect that. And because we have juxtapositions of lots of different sized works, just if we had those kind of labels everywhere, it would become an exercise in label design. So what we did rather than that was have little guides that were available within the space. So, and there were places to sit, so you could just spend time there. There were also different affective registers. So I should have thought of this, but so while you were sitting here, every 10 minutes, you would also get a sound collage composed of Delia Derbyshire. So Delia Derbyshire's archive are also in John Ryland's library, sort of in the kind of, what do you call it, shelf next to Li's. So we commissioned the leading scholar on Delia Derbyshire to produce a sound collage in response. He did that originally for the Speech Acts exhibition in Manchester, and then here he extended it by including field recordings from where both the LYC was based, but also where Delia first worked in a quarry when she moved up there. So it was, I think one of the other things which you will see, and you maybe got a glimpse of it, because even just for Li, the ink painting, the magnetic points, the tinted photographs, that wooden sculptural installation, this idea of the LYC itself as a cosmic point. This is a capacious and a complex practice. So how does one make sense of it? And what we wanted to do was to try and create, for me, Li's is an art of feeling, Yes, if you go to M+, you will see his ink paintings. If you go to Tate, their collecting started with the minimalist reliefs, because quite often what happens is institutions, they assimilate through resemblance. This looks like that, it forms the collection here. So for us, we were really interested in saying, how do we disrupt that and use that affective register of feeling to allow people in. When we had that last open day, it really felt like a fair. So people who were at Kettle's Yard, they're saying, "Oh, we don't remember things like this." And we had people who came down from Cumbria who had gone to the LYC as children, as adults, and then who shared that, oh yes, we could sense that spirit. So I think that's what we were trying to do. I'm sorry there isn't a clear answer, but I think there was within the book, and there was also a video where Amy Tobin, Sarah Turner, and myself gave little bridges into some of the material, and then it's up to people as to how much they want to engage.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I was really interested in how you talked about the other story, the 1989 Hayward Gallery exhibition that Rashid Ayring curated as a project that's haunting British art history. And I've been thinking about that word haunting, which is related to this term that I learned from you, the art histories of access, right? The way that you write and talk about the potential of art history that would overwhelm the major structures in the field, overwhelm the museum, overwhelm the archive, overwhelm the academia. So these ideas, you've been working with them for over a decade right now. So I was wondering if you could actually share about some of the challenges that you have faced since you started working, or some of the main ones, perhaps.
How long have you got? Yeah. I think one of the things, and you'll sort of see this from just the dates that you've seen. So this started as an archival project, 2013, 2014. I don't know who I should be looking at. So that time, it became a paper in 2015. It became a project in 2017. It was part of an exhibition in 2018 and 19. That exhibition, when Sonia approached me to say, okay, here is this thing, we love you to do it, and this is our budget. And it's like, okay, for that budget, you have 2.5 months of me. and we'll take that 2.5 months and see what we can do. And in that 2.5 months, we were able to raise more money, and Manchester Art Gallery themselves doubled their own contribution because they believed in the project. So I think I think the simple answer is that anything of substance you can't do on your own. It's about how do you bring people together. And I think that's always harder. It always takes longer, but it always produces things that you can't get to yourself. I think it's a bit large question, but we can get into the specifics if you like at a later point. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that incredible romp through your exhibition, Hammad. I'm really struck by how when you work with artists, historical or contemporary, you work with them in conversation. You put them in conversation, as you said. And even more so, you're putting exhibitions in conversation, as well as institutions, from Signals to Kettle's Yard, to the LYC Museum, to the Young Leeson. So you're thinking about all of these components of the art world, always in conversation with one another. And so my question to you is this approach specific to Li because Li himself approached his practice this way? Or is this a approach that, is this your approach that made you attracted to Li as a subject for your work? And I'm asking you this question because you said something very intriguing when you had the Irene and Hockney up, and you said something like, well, some artists, Hockney, confidently engage in art histories, and others, they don't know where they are in that history. So this is where I'm coming from with this question.
Yeah, it's a complex question, and I'll try to answer it in a couple of ways. But one, absolutely, I do recognize, I think, in Li, a shared interest in this idea of ecosystems, of wider ways of working and of being, than the kind of, he was doing all the sorts of things, so he had what we would now call an audience engagement strategy, he was doing what we would now call socially engaged art, he was definitely doing what we've called participatory art, he would send these little booklets of his to friends, so the invitations would always be you and your friends, are sort of welcome. So I was really struck by that imagining, of that. And I think, as you know, and many of these people, I have a misspent youth in financial and professional services. And one of the things that I really have taken from that, particularly from my time as a management consultant, is that I come at exhibitions from a place not of expertise, but of, intense curiosity. And then the exhibition becomes that platform which allows me to gather lots of people from very different people. So people who were funding the LYC, who was the funding officer for Northern Arts, Nicholas Logsdale, who were sharing with us, his stories about, because Li for a time was living, not just showing, but living at the Listen Gallery, because he did not have a place to live. So these kinds of stories, I think, are really rich, and I'm interested in how do we bring them into circulation in productive ways. And I think working with artists, I personally think about art almost always only relationally, in relation to the world, in relation to other artists, in relation to, the artist histories or to wider histories. And I suppose that's kind of how I end up working. The much abused metaphor, which, is this Gujarati proverb about if you're going to eat an elephant, do it in small bites. And that way of working, I think it just allows for something much richer to emerge over time. Sorry, did that get to some bits of your question?
Great response. Thank you.
Maybe it's not so much of a question, but a kind of like a configuration. I was just thinking, because, you know, knowing a little bit in your practice of London, thinking like, where's London, very specific, well-known city, Asia, a kind of large geographical region, but then thinking about his practice and how he went to this not
a cosmopolitan center.
Metropolitan center, and the fact that he stayed there.
Yeah.
Really for the rest of his life. That's a a statement. So I started thinking about, it's a kind of a embedded regional practice in a way. So I'm just wondering how you kind of thought about that and the kind of a choice in embedding yourself in a kind of a specific kind of regional experience and the communities there, and then how do you then as a curator bring that story to, you know, this exhibition that you've now shared?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. And then just thinking about, because he says that in writing about, I mean, he was a poet, you know, so he wrote poetry in 3 languages, his own versions of the 3 languages, but again, that confidence to write poetry in 3 languages. He wrote about that he wanted space and freedom. And that's where Helen Pett's film take its title from as well. And it's that space and freedom that is why perhaps artists since Turner have been going to Cumbria and the Lake District to spend time there. And one of the points that we wanted to make was, and this is a point that was also common to the Speech Acts exhibition, where the Black Artists and Modernism Project had all the national collections in their database, you know, so they were, you know, from Tate to the National Gallery, etc. So there was a deliberate choice on my part in that project to pick on Manchester and Bradford to frame that, to look at those cities that have become cosmopolitan as, you know, directly in dialogue with empire and through its construction. And one of the interesting things was to see the kind of the Tate curators who were coming up to see the exhibition and looking at the labels to see dates of acquisition. Farah Nisa Zaid, you know, 1974. Or, you know, Cartwright Hall had commissioned Sousa in 1949. They'd bought Shamsa in the early 1970s. So things that the Tate started buying 40 years later, you know. So Madeleine Huikas, that Lee showed a video work in 1976. Tate acquired that work in 2017. So just thinking about, you know, what that space and freedom does. Also just from that bits of the art institutional infrastructure. And over the last 5-6 years, I've been working predominantly outside London, other than the Whitechapel and the Barbican post-war modern show, where I was also an advisor to, because there is space and freedom, because there is such, you know, it's such a conservative scene because people are so driven by the need to tickets, you know. It's a Cineplex model, you know. Every Marvel movie gets shown. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. I think Michelle had a question. Oh, then David's got a question as well. I think, go Michelle.
Hi, thank you. Quick question. I was just curious about what the LYC Museum was like and what your encounter with it was like. I would like to hear your encounter and that description of it.
Well, we did 2 pilgrimages. One was the 3 curators, and we went up to see it. It was closed off. We hopped the fence. We ignored that sign. Sarah was about, I think, 6 months pregnant at the time. But anyway, so we walked around, and it was a ruin. You saw little bits, flashes of that in Helen Petz's film. And then last year, as luck would have it, because this book is a gargantuan book, and because all of, Sarah, Amy, and I are doing other things, although we're the editors, we needed to bring in a project editor, and we persuaded my partner Anita to project edit the book. So we decided that we will take our then 13-year-old to also go and see this place where both his parents have been spending so much of their time in. And at that time, we actually managed to get in, because the person who now owns the LYC, who's making it his sort of family house, was there. And we explained who we were, what we were doing. He said, well, go in, just be careful. So we spent time sort of plopping around and seeing the bare bones architecture of the things that we'd seen with Takis and Alicia Clark. Now suddenly, just a building site. So it was both sort of sad, but also kind of liberating. And I've been having this conversation with lots of artists, which was said, right, if it had been granted heritage status, it would be what it is, and it would stay there. But now its energy is released, and its energy is firing all these people who had never heard of Li, from He Gu-yang to Grace Diritu to Annie Kwan, to Bettina Fung, to Aaron Tan, to many of us. I mean, I first went to Kettle's yard because Sarah knew of my interest in Li, and she said, no, you have to come and see this place. And I was like, oh, no. So, no, you just have to come. So we went there, and you could totally see why that would be the case. Sorry, I'm rabbiting on, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavor. David?
Yeah, I'm seeing Li as someone who sort of moved from place to place, as many people do.
Yep.
But my question is about, he wasn't from Taiwan, but he spent time in Taiwan, then he moved to London and further north. Was there any sort of traces of Taiwan in his later work, do you feel, or some sense of what Taiwan might have meant to him, given to him as an artist or something like that? I can imagine, Taiwanese curators might want to sort of take ownership of him or something for his time there. But I'm interested more in how you see his perspective of what that phase of his life was for him, because it's also a place he didn't go back to, in the way some like Rashid has had a time when he's gone back to Karachi, and connected. And
Xiao Qin moved back to Taipei, and he sort of passed away there, unfortunately, just before this exhibition opened. It's a good question, and I'm not sure how to answer it, other than that to say that I would argue, and Leslie Ma has written about his time in Taipei in particular, and she picks out a couple of things. I think one, his time as a sort of signals operator in the army. So thinking about that way of mark making, that was drawing away from the sort of the ink tradition of a lot of his fellow contemporaries, including people like Xiao Qin and others. So Li made these leaps, I think, sort of formally, but he maintained those sort of calligraphic exercise, worked on wood, but I mean, and this is a classic example. So that wooden work right at the back, I don't think Li could have done if he hadn't seen David Nash at work. And David showed twice at the LYC. It was the first time that David himself started working on the basis of, have axe, will travel. So it brought no works, but made the works from the wood around that he found. I don't think Li would have done those performative self-portraits if he had not seen the works of people like Andy Goldsworthy. So he's somebody who is absorbing this and blending it into this vast expanse, and is able to provide that bridge where these different tribes can meet. So yeah, I think obviously his time in Taiwan informed that practice, but I don't think it kind of ever stopped. And I think that way of working with people, I think that's the first time where he did that. And the other thing, and this is I think a speculation and conjecture on my part, is I can't believe that his experience as an orphan did not shape him. And that idea of the children's art room where he spends a day, where children can play with these toys which 4 Tate guards will rush at you and body tackle you if you go anywhere near now. So just thinking about that mode to what art is.
I'm actually very much intrigued by the notion of how the artists you invited to join the exhibition that have adopted Li as the cultural ancestor is like something I've never heard of, and I'm very overwhelmed by the notion. What do you think the artists saw in him that would essentially make that shift? Like, what made you coin that term, basically?
So that is the title of the essay by Annie Kwan in the book, and about that recognition. I mean, earlier on, I have for many years talked about that I'm sort of resistant to this idea of the unhinged contemporary. What I call this contemporary that just happens, that is not connected, unconnected to in critical dialogue with the past. I would argue that that's always there, but sometimes those hinges are not visible. And I'm interested in that personally. So I think that's one thing. The second thing, as I was just describing earlier, is that my own interest is very often is of triangulation and relational. So some of these artists that I shared is, I was making the call. So people like Grace, to say, oh, I see your practice, Grace, and I'm working on this. I think you will have something to see and do. And there was not just Grace. There were, I think, about 3 or 4 other artists from the British Art Show that I could see, working in simpatico with Li's practice. But then in the end, we decided to work with Grace. People like Annie, Aaron, even Hegu, although she was responding to seeing something that we'd done, they were coming to that conclusion or that idea themselves. And I think they would be seeing different things. Without putting words in people's mouths, I would think the Asia Art Activism crew will be seeing how the difficulty they are having in finding space in an institutional art world in the 2010s was not so different from the difficulty. If anything, Li had an easier splash. He came in through signals, and his first gallery show was Listen. So I think that sort of shared biographical sort of connections and journeys were there. With Hegu, I think in particular that notion of participation. I think Li practiced it at a different level. So there aren't the attendants who will come with their gloves and move things around. But Hegu is interested in that idea of things that move, shift, shape. And I think I think different artists were seeing different things in Li. And I think this was a practice expansive enough. When I first went up to meet David Nash, he's this kind of legendary figure. It took 5 trains to get from London to his studio, in North Wales. And we had this sort of list of questions on the train that we're going to ask him about this and what they talk about. And we got there, And over lunch, we established that he and Li didn't talk much. You know, he had shown at LYC twice. His partner, who was also in the show, Claire had shown at the LYC twice. They had gone there with their family. They spoke about every time they showed at the LYC as if they were visiting family, but they didn't talk much. But as a result of our conversations, David then sort of wrote back to me later on saying, actually, you know, my work I can now see as a cosmic point. So he started reinterpreting his own work, the moving boulder piece, where this piece of wooden boulder has moved through the rivers over 26 years and is now lost into the sea. He now calls a cosmic point piece. So I think those conversations, I think I'm getting lost in my own sort of storytelling. But I think these artists are finding there's such an expansive practice that they find their own way of overlapping with it.
Hammad, I think this is a great point to end and to wrap up for today. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time, and we really hope to see you again in Hong Kong very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.